I bought a shack to bury my past, but the widow next door made me want to live again. The shack cost Timothy Marsh $43 and represented the absolute limit of his ambition. It sat 3 miles outside Salvation Ridge, accessible only by a rutted trail that disappeared entirely during heavy rains. The roof leaked in 4 places, the door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the previous owner had apparently used the interior walls for target practice. But it was his, bought with money he'd saved by living on nothing but hardtack and shame for 6 months, and most importantly, it was far enough from civilization that no one would bother looking for him here. Timothy was 29 years old, stood 5'5" in boots that added an optimistic 2 inches, and possessed the kind of slight build that made people instinctively want to protect him or push him around, depending on their temperament. He'd spent the last decade of his life in St. Louis, working as a clerk in his uncle's shipping office, engaged to a respectable woman named Carolyn, living a life so ordinary it could have been drawn with a straight edge and ruler. Then came the night that changed everything: the robbery, the gun, Caroline's brother bleeding out on the warehouse floor, while Timothy stood frozen, unable to move, unable to help, unable to do anything except watch and shake. The brother survived, but something in Caroline's eyes died when she looked at Timothy afterward. The wedding was called off quietly. The family stopped speaking to him, and Timothy discovered that a reputation for cowardice once earned sticks to a man like pitch. So he'd run, bought a horse, packed what little he owned, and headed west until the money and courage both ran out. Salvation Ridge was the end of the line, a dying mining town hanging on through sheer stubbornness, populated by people who'd also run out of options or reasons to keep going. The shack would be his tomb, Timothy decided, not literally, though the structure looked like it might collapse in a strong wind, but metaphorically, a place to bury the person he'd been and wait quietly for time to finish the job. He moved in on a Tuesday in late October, when the first snow already dusted the mountain peaks. He had supplies for winter barely, and a plan that consisted entirely of surviving until spring and then deciding whether survival was worth the effort. His only neighbor was a quarter-mile away, visible through the sparse trees, a larger structure that was still technically a shack, but had been expanded and reinforced until it resembled something almost substantial. Smoke rose from its chimney daily. Occasionally, Timothy saw movement near the property, a massive figure chopping wood or tending to what looked like a vegetable garden protected by makeshift windbreaks. The figure was Jumbo Jess, according to the supplies merchant in town who'd sold Timothy a winter's worth of beans and flour. "You'll be neighbors," the merchant had said, his tone suggesting this was not good news. "Keep to yourself, and she'll do the same, probably." She? Well, the merchant had shifted uncomfortably. "That's what she goes by, Jess Ironwood. Some say she used to be a he, or maybe still is. Hard to tell with that one. Big as a barn and twice as mean. Came out here 5 years back with a husband, though Lord knows what kind of man marries something like that. Found him dead 2 winters ago. Hunting accident, she claimed. Convenient accident, if you ask me." Timothy hadn't asked, but the merchant continued anyway, warming to his subject. "Wears a wedding dress everywhere, day and night. Tattered old thing, filthy as sin. Never takes it off, like she's mourning or mocking or maybe just mad. Townfolk tried to run her out after the husband died, didn't want no murderer that close, but she wouldn't budge. Got a shotgun and a temper, and together They convinced people to leave well enough alone. Timothy had absorbed this information with the numb acceptance he'd developed for most things lately. A possibly murderous neighbor in a wedding dress seemed appropriately gothic for his self-imposed exile. For the first 2 weeks, they maintained perfect mutual avoidance. Timothy saw Jess occasionally through his cracked window, always at a distance, always moving with surprising grace despite obvious size. The wedding dress was real, he confirmed, a white-turned gray garment that billowed around a frame that looked capable of wrestling bears. Then came the wolves. Timothy woke to screaming, animals screaming, the kind that raises every primitive alarm in the human brain. He stumbled to his window in the pre-dawn darkness and saw, by moonlight, Jess's property under attack. 3 wolves, made bold by hunger, had gotten into what looked like a chicken coop. Jess emerged from her shack wielding an axe, charging the wolves in her wedding dress like some nightmare bride from a fever dream. Timothy watched, frozen as always as Jess fought. She killed one wolf with a swing that nearly decapitated it. The other 2 retreated but didn't flee, circling, looking for an opening. Jess's shoulder showed blood. She'd been bitten. She swayed, exhaustion or blood loss making her movement slower. Before Timothy could consciously decide to move, he was outside in his nightshirt, running through the snow with the rifle he'd bought for protection but never expected to use. His hands shook so badly he nearly dropped it twice. He'd never shot at anything living, barely knew how to aim, but he fired anyway. The shot went wide, missing the wolves by yards, but the sound startled them enough that they broke and ran. Jess spun toward him, axe raised, blood streaming down her arm. In the moonlight, her face was angular and hard, framed by short dark hair. She was easily 6'6", broad-shouldered and thick with muscle beneath the absurd dress. Her eyes, shadowed and dangerous, fixed on Timothy. "You shot at my property," she said, her voice deeper than most women's but not quite masculine. "I shot at the wolves." Timothy's voice came out as a squeak. "They were attacking you. I had it handled. You were bleeding. Still am. Don't change the fact I didn't ask for help." She lowered the axe slightly, but didn't relax. "You the one bought the Henderson place?" "Yes, Timothy Marsh." "Jess Ironwood. We're neighbors now, I guess. Don't make a habit of coming over uninvited." She turned and walked back toward her shack, cradling her injured arm. Timothy stood in the snow, adrenaline fading, leaving him shaking and cold and oddly exhilarated. He'd done something, not much, and probably ineffectively, but something. For the first time in months, he felt briefly alive. He returned to his shack but couldn't sleep. At dawn, he made a decision that felt simultaneously brave and foolish. He'd check on his neighbor. The wound had looked deep. Infection was deadly out here. It was just being neighborly, he told himself. Nothing more. He approached Jess's property cautiously, calling out before he got too close. No response. He called again. Still nothing. Worried now, he came closer and saw the door hanging open. Inside, Jess sat slumped against the far wall, feverish and barely conscious. The wound on her shoulder had been bandaged poorly, already showing signs of infection. Her dress was soaked with blood and sweat. "I'm coming in," Timothy announced to the semi-conscious woman. "Don't shoot me." Over the next 3 days, Timothy learned more about doctoring than he'd ever intended. He cleaned Jess's wound with whiskey that made her scream. He changed bandages. He forced water and broth down her throat during her lucid moments. He slept in a chair by her bed, too afraid to leave in case she took a turn for the worse. During fever dreams, Jess talked. Fragments of a life Timothy had no right to hear, but couldn't help absorbing. Childhood beatings for being wrong, running away at 15, years of survival through strength and stubbornness. A husband named Clayton, who'd seemed kind until the wedding night, when kindness revealed itself as mask for cruelty. "Hit me," she mumbled in her delirium. "Every day. Said I deserved it for lying, for being what I was, for tricking him." Timothy listened, horrified as the story emerged in pieces. Clayton's escalating abuse, his drunken rages, the way he'd mock her in town, parading his freak wife for laughs. And finally, the hunting trip where Clayton had gotten drunk and mean, had hit her one time too many, and Jess had hit back. Once, hard enough that Clayton fell and struck his head on a rock. "Didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "Just wanted him to stop. But he died, and everyone said I murdered him. Wanted me hanged. Would have, except no proof, no witnesses. Just me in this dress saying it was accident. They let me live, but they hate me. Everyone hates me." On the fourth day, Jess's fever broke. She woke to find Timothy dozing in the chair, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're still here." Timothy jerked awake. "You're better. Thank God. I was worried the fever would—" "Why are you still here?" She pushed herself up, wincing. "Why didn't you leave once I was stable?" "You needed help." "People don't help me. People avoid me, or they hurt me. Those are the two options I've learned to expect." Timothy met her eyes, those dark, guarded eyes that had seen too much cruelty. "Maybe I'm learning there's a third option, where people just act like people should." Something flickered across Jess's face. Not quite trust, but perhaps the memory of what trust used to feel like. "You heard me talking, in the fever." "Yeah. So you know, about Clayton, about what I am." "I know you were being beaten. I know you defended yourself. I know you've lived with people's judgment for something that wasn't your fault." "You don't know anything," Jess said, but without venom. "You don't know what it's like being something the world says shouldn't exist." "No," Timothy agreed quietly. "But I know what it's like being someone the world says isn't enough. It's not the same, but it's adjacent." They looked at each other across the small room, two people who'd run to the edges of the world to escape judgment, finding themselves accidentally neighbors in exile. "You should go home," Jess said finally. "Your place. I'm fine now." Timothy stood, bones creaking from days in the chair. "I'll check on you tomorrow, just to make sure." "Don't." "I will anyway." He did, and the day after. Each time Jess protested, but allowed it. Their conversations grew longer, moving from terse exchanges to something resembling actual dialogue. Timothy learned that Jess read voraciously. She had a collection of water-damaged books stacked in corners. Jess learned that Timothy could cook better than survival rations, a skill he demonstrated by bringing meals until she could manage for herself. "Why are you here?" Jess asked one afternoon as Timothy checked her bandage. "Really here, in this God-forsaken place." Timothy's hand stilled. "I'm running from something too, not violence, just myself. The person I proved myself to be when it mattered." "Which was?" "A coward." He said it simply, without drama. "Someone died because I was too afraid to act. Not literally died, he survived, but part of him died. And everyone saw, including me. Especially me. Jess absorbed this. That's why you're out here? Punishing yourself? Hiding from myself? Same thing, maybe. And yet, you came running when wolves attacked. Seems like a coward would have stayed inside. That's different. How? Timothy couldn't answer. They sat in silence until he finished with the bandage and left. Winter arrived in earnest 2 weeks later. Timothy's shack proved inadequate for the cold, despite his best efforts to seal the gaps. He burned through firewood faster than expected, rationed his food carefully, and tried not to think about the long months ahead. The blizzard hit on the winter solstice, howling out of the mountains with apocalyptic fury. Timothy woke to snow already drifted against his door, the interior temperature barely above freezing despite the stove burning. By midday, he'd burned through most of his remaining firewood. By evening, he could see his breath inside. He knew he was in trouble, real trouble, the kind that killed people quietly while they sat in their inadequate shelters, convincing themselves it would be fine. He had 2 choices, stay and likely freeze, or make for Jess's place and hope he didn't die in the attempt. He chose motion over stillness, action over passivity. It felt appropriate somehow. The quarter-mile might as well have been 10. Snow blinded him. Wind knocked him down twice. Cold bit through every layer he wore. He was crawling by the time he reached Jess's door, too frozen to even knock properly. He slumped against it, consciousness fading, thinking hazily that at least he'd tried. At least, this once, he'd chosen to fight instead of freeze. The door opened inward, and Timothy fell into warmth. He woke wrapped in blankets by a fire that felt like the sun itself. Jess loomed over him, her face etched with concern that shifted to relief when his eyes opened. "You damn fool," she said. "Another 10 minutes and you'd be dead." "Sorry," Timothy managed through chattering teeth. "Don't apologize. Just warm up before I have to explain to town why there's a corpse in my shack." For 3 days, the blizzard raged. Jess and Timothy were trapped together in the close quarters of her expanded shack. There was only one bed. Jess took the floor without discussion, piling blankets into a nest near the stove. They shared meals, played cards with a worn deck Jess produced, read aloud from her books when conversation lagged, and they talked, really talked. The enforced intimacy and isolation broke down the walls they'd both erected. Timothy told the full story of the robbery, of Caroline's brother, of his paralysis when action was needed. Jess told of Clayton in more detail, the slow escalation from criticism to slaps to beatings that left her unable to walk for days. "I'm not a woman," Jess said on the second night, the fire burning low. "Not the way most people mean. Born male, they said, but I never felt like that body was right. Tried to fix it best I could, with what little money I had. Wore dresses because they felt right, even when everyone said they were wrong. The wedding dress, Clayton insisted on it. Said if I wanted to play woman, I'd better commit fully. So I wore it at our wedding, and kept wearing it after because by then it felt like armor, like proof I wasn't ashamed even when everyone said I should be. And after he died, couldn't take it off. It was all I had that was mine, my choice, even if it started as his cruelty. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Timothy said. "I think it does." On the 3rd day, as the storm finally broke, they sat together, watching the weak sun struggle through clouds. "You're not a coward," Jess said abruptly. "I've been thinking about what you told me. You froze once, in a moment of crisis. That doesn't define your entire existence. Everyone else Seemed to think it did. Everyone else wasn't here when you ran at wolves with a rifle you barely knew how to use. Wasn't here when you spent 4 days nursing a stranger through fever. Wasn't here when you walked through a blizzard instead of giving up. She looked at him. Those were brave things, Timothy. Small, brave things. Compared to what was required of me before, all brave things are small when you're the one doing them. It's only in retrospect they look big. She paused. I've spent 5 years believing I'm a monster because I killed a man, because I'm not what people think I should be, because I take up space the world wishes I wouldn't. But having you here, seeing how you look at me, not with disgust or pity, but just acceptance, it makes me wonder if maybe the world's been wrong. Timothy felt something crack open in his chest. The world's definitely been wrong about you. They cleared a path between their shacks over the following days. Timothy returned to his inadequate shelter, but came to Jess's property daily, helping with chores, sharing meals, rebuilding the chicken coop destroyed by wolves. They became, against all expectations and despite all their individual damage, something like friends. Then Clayton's cousin arrived. His name was Marcus Ironwood, and he rode into Salvation Ridge in early March with 2 hired men and a lawyer from Denver. He carried documents. He announced loudly in the saloon, proving that Clayton's land rightfully belonged to the Ironwood family, and he carried testimony that Jess had murdered Clayton in cold blood for that land. News reached Jess and Timothy within hours. The town marshal, a tired man named Hendricks, rode out to deliver the summons personally. There's to be a hearing, he explained. Town council will determine if there's enough evidence to hold you for trial. If there is, you'll be taken to Denver for formal proceedings. There's no evidence, Jess said flatly, because it was an accident. Self-defense at worst. Nevertheless, hearing's tomorrow at noon. I suggest you attend. After Hendricks left, Jess sat heavily, her face ashen. They'll hang me. Marcus always hated me. Hated that Clayton married me. This is his chance. They can't hang you without proof. Timothy, look at me, really look. I'm everything people fear, everything they think is unnatural and wrong. They want me gone. Marcus is just giving them a legal excuse. Timothy felt that familiar paralysis creeping in, the weight of knowing action was required but being incapable of taking it. Jess needed help. Real help. The kind that required standing up in public, speaking up, being counted. The kind of thing cowards didn't do. He spent the night in his shack, not sleeping, wrestling with himself. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He dressed in his least damaged clothes, walked to Jess's shack, and knocked. I'm going with you to the hearing. Jess looked at him blankly. Why? Because you shouldn't face it alone. Because I know what really happened. You told me yourself. Because, he took a breath, because you're my friend, and friends show up for each other. Timothy, this will make you a target too. Association with me is already social suicide. Actively defending me? The town will... I don't care about the town. I came here to bury myself anyway. Might as well bury myself doing something worthwhile. Something shifted in Jess's expression. Not quite hope, but perhaps the shadow of it. All right, but if it goes badly, you run. Don't let them drag you down with me. We'll see. They walked into town together, the towering figure in the tattered wedding dress and the slight man beside her. Townspeople stopped to stare. Whispers followed them like smoke. By the time they reached the meeting hall where the hearing would be held, a crowd had gathered. Inside, The town council sat behind a long table, 5 men who ran Salvation Ridge through a combination of stubbornness and lack of alternatives. Marcus Ironwood sat front row with his lawyer, looking confident. His hired men flanked the door. Marshal Hendricks called the hearing to order and read the charges. Suspicion of murder for profit. Marcus's lawyer presented testimony from townsfolk who claimed Clayton had feared his wife, that he'd spoken of wanting to leave her, that the hunting trip where he died had been unusual. Jess never accompanied him before. Why that day? It was all circumstantial, but damning in its accumulation. The council members' faces grew harder with each testimony. When the lawyer finished, the head councilman turned to Jess. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Jess stood, and the crowd actually gasped at her full height. In the wedding dress, blood-stained and travel-worn, she looked simultaneously ridiculous and formidable. She faced the council without flinching. "Clayton beat me," she said simply, "every day, sometimes twice a day. He'd get drunk and mean, and I'd be his outlet. Started the day after we married, lasted 3 years. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, no money, no options, and maybe because I believed him when he said I deserved it, for being what I am, for lying about being a proper wife." The crowd murmured. Marcus stood. "Lies. My cousin would never." "Your cousin was a monster," Jess cut him off. "And you knew. You were here once, 2 years before he died. You saw the bruises. I caught you watching when he hit me for burning dinner. You saw, and you said nothing." Marcus's face reddened. "That's slander. The hunting trip was his idea," Jess continued, addressing the council. "He wanted to teach me to shoot. Thought it would be funny watching me fail. He got drunk, started hitting me. Said he was going to kill me out there, make it look like an accident. I fought back, hit him once. He fell. His head struck a rock. He died." She paused, and into the silence Timothy stood. Every eye turned to him. He felt his legs shaking, his hands trembling, but he kept standing. "I'd like to speak," he said, voice cracking. "And who are you?" the head councilman asked. "Timothy Marsh. I'm Jess's neighbor, and I believe her." "Your belief isn't evidence." "No, but my testimony might be." Timothy took a breath. "I've spent considerable time with Jess over the winter. She's told me about Clayton, about the abuse. She has scars, old scars, consistent with her story, and more importantly, I've seen who she is. Gentle, kind. Someone who helped me when I was freezing to death, even though she had no reason to. Someone who tends injured animals and reads books and grows vegetables in impossible soil because she's trying to build a life, not destroy one." "That's character testimony," the lawyer objected. "Not relevant." "It's completely relevant," Timothy shot back, surprised by the force in his own voice. "You're asking us to believe Jess is a cold-blooded killer who murdered for land. I'm telling you, that's incompatible with who she actually is. You want to convict her, fine, but do it based on evidence, not on fear of someone different." Marcus stood again. "This man is clearly biased, probably her lover. His word is worthless." Timothy felt heat rise in his face, but pushed through. "I'm not her lover. I'm her friend. And yes, I'm biased toward truth over fear, toward justice over mob mentality. You want to punish Jess not because you have proof, but because she makes you uncomfortable, because she doesn't fit your definition of acceptable." "Mr. Marsh," the head councilman interrupted, "this is highly irregular." So is condemning someone without evidence. Timothy's voice rose. So is ignoring years of abuse because the abuser was a man and the victim was complicated. So is letting Marcus steal land because he's conventional and Jess isn't. The hall erupted. Some people shouted agreement, others condemnation. The council called for order. Through the chaos, Timothy caught Jess's eye. She looked stunned, as if watching someone she barely recognized. Finally, the head councilman restored quiet. "We'll deliberate. Everyone out." The wait lasted 2 hours. Timothy and Jess sat on the steps outside, not speaking, just existing in shared anxiety. When they were finally called back in, the council's verdict was written on their faces before anyone spoke. "We find insufficient evidence for murder charges," the head councilman announced. "The land remains with Jess Ironwood as Clayton's legal widow. However," he paused, "this council strongly recommends Mrs. Ironwood consider relocating permanently. Tensions in this town are high. We cannot guarantee her safety or continued welcome." It wasn't justice, but it wasn't hanging. Jess accepted with a tight nod. Marcus stormed out, making threats under his breath. The townspeople dispersed, many throwing hostile glares. Outside, Jess turned to Timothy. "You stood up for me, in public, knowing it would cost you. It didn't cost me anything I cared about. It cost you the town's goodwill, whatever chance you had at integrating here." "I never wanted to integrate. I wanted to hide." Timothy managed a weak smile. "Turns out, hiding's lonely. I'd rather be ostracized with a friend than invisible alone." Jess pulled him into a hug that lifted him slightly off his feet. When she set him down, both had tears in their eyes. "Let them hate us," she said quietly. "We'll build something anyway." They did. Over the following months, they combined their properties, pooling resources. Timothy's inadequate shack became storage. They expanded Jess's structure, adding a second room, reinforcing the whole building. They planted a larger garden, acquired more chickens, even bought a cow they named Perseverance as a joke that became genuine affection. The town continued its ostracism. Merchants occasionally refused them service. Children threw rocks. But they also found unexpected allies. The Chinese laundry owner who'd faced his own discrimination. The widow who'd been shunned for remarrying too quickly. The half-Cheyenne boy whose mixed heritage made him perpetual outsider. Then came the fire. It started in the saloon on a hot August night. Overturned lamp, drunk patrons, dry wood. By the time anyone noticed, the building was engulfed. Flames spread to adjacent structures. The town had a volunteer fire brigade, but it was overwhelmed within minutes. Jess and Timothy saw the glow from their property and rode in to help. The scene was chaos. People running, screaming, forming bucket lines that were too little too late. The saloon collapsed. The general store caught. And in the confusion, someone screamed that a child was trapped in the boarding house next to the saloon. The owner's daughter, 5 years old, had been sleeping on the second floor. Her mother stood outside, hysterical, held back by men who knew the building was death. Timothy heard the screaming child, saw the flames, felt that familiar paralysis trying to lock his limbs. But this time, he fought through it. Before he could talk himself out of it, he was running toward the burning building. "Timothy, no!" Jess's voice behind him, but he didn't stop. The heat was unbearable. Smoke choked him immediately. He couldn't see, could barely breathe, but he kept moving toward where the screaming came from. upstairs that were already burning, down a hallway where paint bubbled on the walls, into a room where a little girl huddled under a bed, too terrified to move. Timothy grabbed her, wrapped her in a blanket, and ran. The stairs collapsed as he descended. He jumped the last section, felt something in his ankle give way, but kept moving. Out the door, into relatively clean air, into her mother's arms. Then his lungs gave up. Timothy collapsed, coughing black soot, his vision darkening. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Jess's face above him, her expression fierce with concern. He woke 3 days later in Jess's bed. His throat felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. His ankle was splintered. His skin showed burns in places. But he was alive. Jess sat beside the bed, and when she saw him wake, she started crying. "You stupid, brave, ridiculous man," she said through tears. "You almost died. You actually almost died." "The girl?" Timothy croaked. "Fine, completely fine. You saved her." Jess wiped her eyes. "The whole town's talking about it. You're a hero." "Don't feel like one." "Heroes never do." She took his hand carefully, mindful of the burns. "Timothy, I need to tell you something. While you were unconscious, while I was sitting here wondering if you'd wake up, I realized something." "What?" "I don't want to just survive anymore. These past months with you, building our place, facing the town, just existing together, it's been the first time in my life I felt like living was worth the effort. You did that. You made me want more than just enduring." Timothy squeezed her hand weakly. "You did the same for me. I came here to bury my past, hide from who I was. But you made me want to be someone different, someone better. We're quite a pair, the giant in a wedding dress and the coward who found courage. I prefer the strongest person I've ever met and the man learning what strength actually means." They sat in comfortable silence until Timothy drifted back to sleep, his hand still in Jess's. His recovery took weeks. The town's attitude shifted dramatically. Not everyone, but enough. The mother of the saved girl brought food daily. The doctor refused payment for treating Timothy. Even some council members tipped their hats when passing, but the core of hostility remained. Some people would never forgive Jess for being different, or Timothy for defending her. That was fine. They'd learned to live with worse. On the first anniversary of Timothy's arrival, they sat on their expanded porch, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd come to know intimately. "I bought a shack to bury my past," Timothy said quietly. "Thought I was done, finished, just waiting out the clock. And now? Now I wake up and think about what needs planting, what repairs to make, what book we'll read tonight. I think about tomorrow instead of yesterday." Jess smiled, that rare expression that transformed her hard features into something almost soft. "I spent 5 years mourning a life I thought I'd never have, wearing this dress like a funeral shroud. But lately, I've been thinking maybe it's time to change that. Not literally. I'll probably wear this rag until it disintegrates. But metaphorically." "How so?" "Maybe it doesn't have to be mourning clothes. Maybe it can just be what I wear, my choice, my armor when I need it, my comfort when I don't. Not defined by what it represents to others, but what it means to me." Timothy understood. "And what does it mean to you?" "Survival, defiance, hope that someday someone would see past it to who I actually am." She looked at him. "You did that. You saw me. You saw me, too. The real me. Not the coward or the clerk or the man running from his past. Just me." They sat as darkness fell. Two people who'd run to the edge of the world to escape judgment, finding instead that the edge was exactly where they needed to be, where being broken wasn't a flaw, but a shared language, where starting over didn't mean forgetting the past, but learning to carry it differently. "We should expand the garden next year," Jess said eventually. "Maybe add some fruit trees. They'll take years to produce, but we have time." "We have time," Timothy agreed, and the words felt like a promise, not just to continue surviving, but to actually build something, a home, a life, a future neither had dared imagine when they first became reluctant neighbors. The widow next door hadn't just made Timothy want to live again. She'd shown him how. And in return, he'd shown her that strength came in many forms, that courage could be quiet, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to apologize for existing. Together, in their shacks at the edge of civilization, they proved that outcast plus outcast didn't equal double isolation. Sometimes it equaled home.